Donald Trump has unveiled his Middle East peace plan. He's calling it the deal of the century. Many Palestinians have a few other phrases for it. They weren't consulted. The plan offers a two-state solution of a kind, and the president began with one of Israel's top priorities.
Under this vision, Jerusalem will remain Israel's undivided, very important, undivided capital.
While both Israel and the Palestinians hold competing claims to the holy city, and the Palestinians insist that East Jerusalem be the capital of their future state, President Trump is instead proposing the creation of a Palestinian state with a capital in eastern Jerusalem. Here's the BBC's Washington bureau chief, Paul Danaher, who used to be based in Jerusalem, saying, look, most casual observers won't understand the massive difference between offering the Palestinians a capital in East Jerusalem and in eastern Jerusalem. East includes the holy sites. Eastern could mean the outer suburbs of the municipal boundaries away from the old city. And Paul goes on to say this is a classic example of how the language of diplomacy is important in this part of the world. The interpretation of words underpins the entire conflict. Well, let's hear more from President Trump.
I want this deal to be a great deal for the Palestinians. It has to be. Today's agreement is a historic opportunity for the Palestinians to finally achieve an independent state of their very own. After 70 years of little progress, this could be the last opportunity they will ever have.
President Trump calling it an agreement, but it's not really an agreement because the Palestinians aren't agreeing to it. This is a map that's been released by the Americans showing how this proposal would work. President Trump says it illustrates the territorial compromises that Israel's willing to make. Here's Paul Danaher again, our Washington bureau chief, saying what this map shows is that Israel will control entry in and out of the Palestinian areas, but even within this reduced territory, Israeli settlements will remain. So, plenty for the Palestinians to object to, it seems, judging by their response. We'll have more on those issues later. First of all, here's Israel's Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu, who said earlier this is one of the most important days of his life.
For too long, far too long, the very heart of the land of Israel, where our patriarchs prayed, our prophets preached, and our kings ruled, has been outrageously branded as illegally occupied territory. Well, today, Mr. President, you are puncturing this big lie.
And many in the international community do consider Israeli settlements illegal under international law. Now, the Middle East peace plan is 80 pages long, so there's a lot to digest. But before it was even announced, the Palestinians said they were going to reject it. They say they weren't consulted. Since then, the Palestinian President Mahmoud Abbas has spoken.
I say to Trump and Netanyahu, Jerusalem is not for sale. All our rights are not for sale and are not for bargain. And your deal, the conspiracy, will not pass.
Also, Hamas, the militant group based in Gaza, has said the president's statement is aggressive, saying Trump's statement about Jerusalem is nonsense and Jerusalem will always be a land for the Palestinians. This spokesperson went on, the Palestinians will confront this deal and Jerusalem will remain a Palestinian land. We also have these pictures from Gaza. As you can see, hundreds of people turned out to take part in protests against what the Americans and the Israelis are proposing. Well, let's move from Gaza to the West Bank. Barbara Usher is in Ramallah with more on what the Palestinian President Mahmoud Abbas has been saying.
It was quite a strong denunciation of the Trump plan. He said no to the plan 1,000 times, no, no, no. He particularly mentioned Mr. Trump's comments about the undivided capital of Jerusalem going to Israel, and he said Jerusalem is not for sale, our rights are not for sale. In terms of the response, he didn't make a public call for action, but he did say that this would spur Palestinian efforts to bridge the divide in the national movement between the Palestinian Authority and Hamas, that he'd spoken to the Hamas leader in Gaza and that he wanted to visit Gaza to try to work out a joint response to this. He also said that the Palestinians needed to build on the international support they did have for their rights in Congress and as well as in the European in the European Union. However, he did not mention something that is most contentious with many Palestinians, and that is the ongoing coordination between the Palestinian Authority with Israel in terms of security. So quite a strong rhetoric against what has happened, so a sort of strong statement about the need to do something about this division in the national movement, but not really any change announced anyway in terms of the status quo of how things are operating.
And what's Mahmoud Abbas's position in terms of speaking directly with Donald Trump or with Benjamin Netanyahu about this plan, or indeed any other plan he may have?
Well, he hasn't spoken with Mr. Trump or the Trump administration for more than 2 years. The Palestinians boycotted this process after the Trump administration moved its embassy to Jerusalem and recognized Jerusalem as Israel's capital. At that point, they said, we know where this is going. There's no point in engaging in it. And in fact, Mr. Abbas said, I was right. I was right to say that all along. Some people said, wait and see what the plan actually is. But in fact, now that we see the plan, we can see that this is where it was headed. And so he has made no suggestion that that is going to change, as he has rejected the plan put forward by Mr. Trump. And the President of the United States has said he's going to give the Palestinians some time to try to rethink whether they're going to change their position. And in some of the reporting about that, it was suggested that perhaps Mr. Trump is even thinking after Mr. Abbas there may be more compliance. I don't know if that is true. But certainly Mr. Abbas has been quite firm about his response. In fact, we even were told that he rejected a telephone call from Mr. Trump ahead of time to talk about the release.
Let's remind ourselves of the historical context of these disagreements. Israel was created in 1948 under a UN plan which envisioned a Jewish state and a Palestinian state. But after a regional conflict, only the Jewish state came into being, and there's been a dispute over land ever since. Fast forward to 1967, and Israel captured East Jerusalem and the West Bank from Jordan, and that created 250,000 Palestinian refugees. Hundreds of thousands of Israelis also moved into some of that land. According to the Israeli settlement watchdog Peace Now, at the end of last year, over 413,000 Israeli settlers lived in the West Bank in 132 settlements, regarded by most of the international community as illegal. The areas in orange here are under Palestinian civil control. The faint purple marks Israeli military and civilian control. And notice how each Palestinian area is surrounded by Israeli-controlled territory. The darker purple marks settlements. Well, the status of Israel remains one of the hardest issues to resolve. Both sides claim it as their capital. Today we've heard which side of the argument Donald Trump comes down on that particular discussion. And what happens with the Jewish settlements in the West Bank and in East Jerusalem is still proving an intractable issue between the Israelis and the Palestinians. Here's some pictures of those settlements. They've been one of the reasons for the collapse of numerous rounds of peace talks. These are some of the Israeli settlements under construction in the West Bank. Some are isolated, protected, built very much with security in mind. President Trump has said no Palestinians or Israelis will be uprooted from their homes in his plan, suggesting that these existing Jewish settlements in the Israeli-occupied West Bank will remain. Now, a negotiated peace did seem possible if you go back almost 30 years ago. A series of secret talks in Norway began what became known as the Oslo peace process. Famously, I'm sure you've seen this image, there was a ceremony at the White House in 1993 presided over by President Bill Clinton, and Israel's Prime Minister Yitzhak Rabin and the Palestinian leader Yasser Arafat signed a series of documents. You can see them doing so. Actually, that's not a picture. I'll show you that picture in a minute. They signed a series of documents in which they agreed to continue to negotiate, and the Palestinians recognized the state of Israel. The Israelis accepted the Palestinian Liberation Organization represented the Palestinian people. But as you saw in that image I brought up just then, things were very much derailed by Yitzhak Rabin's assassination by a Jewish extremist in 1995. Successive Israeli prime ministers since, including Benjamin Netanyahu, have all accepted the idea of a Palestinian state, but have had very different views on how that should manifest itself. Well, we should also talk about the timing of this announcement today. In part, a simple push for peace in the Middle East, but it may also serve political needs of Donald Trump and Benjamin Netanyahu. Bear in mind, both men face elections and both men face prosecution. Mr. Trump's being impeached in the US Senate for high crimes and misdemeanours. Mr. Netanyahu has been formally indicted on criminal charges of corruption, bribery and breach of trust. We saw this from The Independent's Middle East correspondent Blair saying Netanyahu's been formally indicted on corruption charges just hours before he's expected to join Trump at the launch of this peace plan. Netanyahu dropped his bid for immunity after it became clear the Israeli parliament would vote against it. What a day, says Blair. Well, someone else who's been reacting to today's news is the former British Prime Minister Tony Blair. Once he stopped being Prime Minister, one role he took on was Middle East envoy to the US, Russia, the UN and the EU. He did that for 8 years, and he's been speaking to the BBC.
One of the things with this administration is they'll do what they're going to do, and you know it's a different form of diplomacy and international policy in one sense, but on the other, what they will say is, well, look, we offered the Palestinian president the chance to engage, and he's not engaged, and so therefore we're just going to do it like this. Now, I think I completely understand how the Palestinians will view that and look at it, but they've got to think strategically at this moment in time, you know, what their options are and what is the right way to put this on the agenda with all the concerns that they have, and to mobilize support from, frankly, the only people who are really going to help them here are going to be the Arab nations and the United States of America itself.